break. We're now moving into the second keynote speech for today. It's a real privilege to welcome Professor Renos Papadopoulos joining us online. Professor Renos Papadopoulos is professor and founder director of the Center of Trauma, Asylum and Refugees and of the MA and PhD program in Refugee Care at the University of Essex. He's a member of the Human Rights Center of the Transitional Justice Network and of the Armed Conflict and Crisis Hub, all at the University of Essex, as well as honorary clinical psychologist at the Tavistock Clinic. He is a practitioner, trainer, and supervisor, clinical psychologist, Jungian psychoanalyst, and systemic family psychotherapist. As a consultant to the United Nations and other organizations, he has been working with refugees, tortured persons, trafficked people, and other survivors of political violence and disasters in many countries. He lectures and offers specialist trainings internationally, and his writings have appeared in 18 languages. So today he will be sharing his insights on the basic framework for the training of staff working in migrant and refugee mental health. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Renos Papadopoulos.
Hello. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you very well.
Right. Thank you very much for your kind invitation and for your introduction. Let's not waste much time. I hope you had wonderful cookies there, and I wish I was there with you. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you today. So let me start immediately sharing my presentation so that we can get on with what I have to say. My aim is really to question certain things. I'm of a certain age that I have been in this field for many, many years, and I've worked in more than 40 countries across wars and natural disasters and many other emergencies. And I would like us to reflect, I would like to reflect myself on these issues from a kind of a refreshing perspective, trying to sort of see again, what is this about? We're talking about migrant and refugee mental health. Do we mean mental health? What do we mean by mental health? Do we mean psychiatric disorders? Do we mean do we refer to psychological symptoms? Do we talk about ordinary distress? Everything is coming under that. And if we were to, I watched most of the presentation earlier, you can see that different people pick up on different aspects of that. Let's go back to Aristotle, who is trying to sort of provide us with some kind of help in terms of understanding different types of well-being, because the fairly recent term that has been introduced in order to bypass these problems that I'm talking about. Are we talking about psychiatric disorders or psychological problems? We say well-being. But what do we mean by well-being? So Aristotle, as you may know, makes a distinction between two types of well-being. The one he calls hedonic, and essentially hedonic refers to the avoidance of suffering and the pursuit of happiness and pleasure. In other words, stopping any symptoms, stopping feeling uncomfortable and feeling on top of the world. And the other he refers to as eudaimonic, as you know, like euphoria, euthanasia. Eu in Greek means good, and demonic is demon, is not devil, but it's the good God. So it's somehow in tune with our own nature, with what God has created us to be. So the eudaimonic is much more about actualizing one's potential, living according to one's unique nature, and acquiring a sense of fulfillment. Let's keep that in mind, because if you really think about it, most of the mental health that we're talking about has degenerated into a hedonic type of well-being. In other words, let's stop any kind of disorder, any kind of distress, any kind of discomfort that people have, which is, of course, a utopia. We cannot stop discomfort and distress, but we should be able to stop severe forms of mental illness as well as other situations. So, I mean, my approach is to sort of go back to the beginnings and try to see, what do we see? What do we see? What do we hear? When we see a picture like this, do we see only the devastation? There is a lot of devastation. There is a lot of suffering that we can see. I don't like putting pictures of human beings. A lot of suffering behind that. But also we can see some remarkable resilience of people keeping on wanting to wear clean clothes, and they wanted to wash them and dry them, etc. So it's not either the pain or the resilience, but it's both. And this is the challenge. Do we have frameworks that can help us to see both? And this is what I'm talking about, epistemological agility, our capacity to perceive different perspectives, to increase the level of precision of what we actually see, how we conceptualize issues, and to adopt different positions in relation to these different perspectives in order to grasp the implications of our position and role in relation to the examined phenomena. Because if we do not do that, what we do is almost imperceptibly, we follow one line, and before we realize, few steps down the road, we're just actually pathologizing those we want to help, and we do not even notice it. Although, of course, in our presentations, there was a lot of awareness about those traps. So when we're talking about the various therapeutic interventions in these situations, sometimes we talk about it by emphasizing, or from the perspective of the therapeutic schools, like psychodynamic, and some of the presentations were saying, yes, this is psychodynamic, other is behavior, other is systemic, etc., etc. Others are focusing on actual techniques without talking about the theoretical background, such as EMDR, mindfulness, etc., tree of life, and there are endless of these things. But what I would like to present here today, or make you aware that it's important for us to keep in mind, are the frameworks. Can we think of a framework, uniqueness of the phenomena that we examine, without, regardless of this set theory or technique that we follow? In other words, we can use any theory or any technique, but we can have a cluster of principles that we can apply creatively in every situation. And this is what I will attempt to present now. In order to do that, let's start from the beginning. What is the nature and the impact of the phenomena that we are confronting every day in this context? And I call them severe forms of collective adversity. Even that, a footnote, I'm not talking about trauma, because trauma is the impact that events have on people. Yet we got confused in our language, and we talk about the experience as the events, and we talk about the events as trauma, and there is a lot of confusion there. Of course, we don't notice it because it's just become part of our language. I like pictorial images, to remind us of what is going on. So I perceive this almost as a kind of a big dark cloud that descends on us. So in a sense, it obstructs our view to sort of see much clearer. Because these phenomena are full of abhorrence and violence and destructiveness, injustices, inhumanity, human rights violations, pain, and all of that, the whole impact is overwhelming. Overwhelming. Overwhelming means that we are flooded. We are overflow. This is flooding us. It sort of paralyzes us. More specifically, I would argue that because it is overwhelming, the impact is overwhelming, because the destructiveness is fairly concrete. You can see it. People have been raped, but there are houses destroyed, etc., etc. The phenomena themselves are highly emotionally charged, and also there is an urgency for pressing needs. We need to do something about. So this cluster, I call it a lethal cluster, creates an overwhelming impact on us. And we basically, get into a fog. But yet, as human beings, we have an unrelenting need to understand things, and therefore, the understanding that we have in these situations, I would argue, tends to be oversimplified, polarized, and lacks complexity. Lacks complexity. When it lacks complexity and it's polarized, the most common form of polarization is black and white. We are good, you are bad. The people we see, some are resilient and traumatized, which of course, I've never seen purely resilient people or purely traumatized people, but we use that every day. And then we talk about good refugees and bad migrants. The whole field is polarized, and I would argue it is a result because we tend to become overwhelmed by the nature of these events. And then even the field itself, if you remember, is divided. Some people call their services strengths-based, and other people call themselves trauma-informed. People who are working with trauma, should they not see the strengths? And people who are working with strengths, should they not see the trauma? But you see the polarization that testifies to the veracity of what I'm saying. And then ultimately it comes to us. And then we say, we're omnipotent and we can do everything because we have evidence-based things, etc. Or we can do nothing, feel completely impotent. You can't beat the system, it's just too much, it's political, etc., etc. This kind of sharp polarization. For me, that is the characteristic of lacking complexity, which means we don't see the complexity, uniqueness, and totality of the situation, but we just follow polarized and oversimplified formulae. Let's be a little bit more specific. I would argue, therefore, that the main consequence of being exposed to severe forms of collective adversities is the lack of complexity. It sounds very anodyne and bland, and or doesn't have scientific evidence, and But let's see what that means. I repeat, because of the concrete destructiveness that we see, the phenomena are highly emotionally charged, and there are urgent and pressing needs. Those three things together, they overwhelm us. In effect, that means that our capacity to process events and experiences tends to become diminished. So if we're really scientists, we should know what is our margin of error. And our margin of error is that when we work in this field, we are likely to be, not likely, very much more than likely, our capacity to process events and experiences is going to be diminished. So I'm telling you about this. I've been lecturing, I've been writing, I've been researching on that. Tomorrow, when I'm working with people, I will remember in what way my capacity is diminished. Not to say, oh, I know that it's not going to be diminished. It's going to be diminished. In psychology, we say we have no space to think, to reflect, and I refer to impulsive thinking, epistemological acting out. We act out epistemologically, which means that we concoct quickly something that sounds wonderful so that we feel comfortable and we can convince others that it feels okay, but actually it is not really, it is oversimplified. Oversimplified, polarizes, there is no complexity, uniqueness, and totality of the situation. And if we, in effect, we are distorting reality with our own theories, with our own approaches. We tend to distort the reality. And how can we plan effectively interventions if our very reality we distort with our own perceptions? In other words, what is it that we're doing what are the phenomena we're doing, what is it that we expect to develop, etc. Let's go back to even basics, about even the etymology, the root of the word trauma. All of us know that it comes from the Greek drama, which refers to injury and wound, and it comes from the verb titrosko, those of you who have researched that a little bit, which means to pierce. But nobody actually bothered to go further, and I've been researching this for a while, and the verb titrosko, the verb to pierce, comes from the verb to rub. And think about it, it's very logical. If you rub yourself, if there is something that is rubbed in a lot, then you are likely to create a wound or an injury. But also rubbing refers to the rubber that you use there to erase something. So there are two outcomes, even from the original meaning of the word trauma, which one is to be injured, like rubbing in, you will pierce the skin and you create a wound or an injury. But the other one is to rub off, like you rub off writing on a piece of paper, or when you rubbing off in terms of burnished. If you rub a metal or something, you will burnish it and you will renew it. That is from the original meaning of the word trauma. It has two meanings, not only the injury, the negative one, but also the renewal. But I'm not talking only about etymology, of course, here. I have not come across anybody in all these years that I work who has been severely traumatized from these situations, who has not said that, doctor, because I went through all of that, now I don't know what to do anymore, how to understand myself, how to carry on with life, which means that their previous ways of seeing themselves, the goals of their lives, their relationships have been erased or have been burnished, and they're open to reviewing them, revising them. The experiences were so powerful that they erased their previous ways of looking at things. And this is also an outcome of the trauma. And my argument always is, do we have a complex way of understanding that we do not only look at the damage that is inflicted, but also the possibilities of renewal that are inherent in any kind of severe form of collective adversity. And that is why over the years, I developed the adversity grid to map out the range of consequences of being exposed to adversity. Of course, we start with the negative, which is the most important one. People are suffering a lot of losses, damages, etc., etc. No question about that. If we're talking about individuals or families, communities, societies, we can have lots of negative effects, and most of us are working exclusively on that, completely ignoring the fact that actually all human beings, regardless of how badly damaged they may have been, they still retain some strengths that remain unchanged. And this is what I call resilience, because that's another word that is completely, distorted, and people have millions of definitions of the word resilience. Resilience I call, which is according to the original meaning in physics, the ability of a body to have the same function as it had before it was exposed to adversity. So when we're working with these people, we're looking at the damage and we're there to repair them and to help them. But we also we want to work holistic. We also look at another part of theirs, which is the strengths that stayed with them despite their exposure to adversity. And then, of course, we go into the positive. And again, I would argue, every human being who was exposed to any form of adversity, has experienced some positive effects, consequences, because they went through that experience. The saying in all languages and in all cultures, whatever doesn't kill you strengthens you. That is coming from that. The question is, are we looking at all three, or are we locked into the negative ones, which has consequences, because you don't need a PhD in psychology to know that if you relate to a person only through their deficits, they will see themselves as such. They will see themselves as victims, and they will see themselves as damage that they need to be repaired. But even going back to the negative ones, we need again more complexity, please, because not all negative effects from being exposed to adversity are the same or are of the same severity. I mean, we know that some people may develop mental health disorders, in other words, psychiatric disorders, let's call them by the name, and that will be the most severe form. So the most severe form for individuals would be psychiatric disorders like PTSD, etc. But also, not all people develop psychiatric disorders, as we know. Some have a various assortment of psychological symptoms that do not add up to a psychiatric disorder. And even a lot of others may not have either, but they are experiencing a lot of human suffering, a lot of discomfort, a lot of distress, which is normal and healthy. As human beings, we are the most adaptable creatures on planet. That's why we dominated and messed up the whole planet. And we adapt to all sorts of situations, which means we respond to distress. It's like sort of, hitting something, and it will take some time to sort of come back. And that is a sign of health. So if we are working with people that they lost everything, members of their families, etc., they changed countries, and they are exhibiting, or they cannot sleep, or they, immediately I went to talk about psychological symptoms. If they cannot sleep, if they are agitated and all of that, that is normal response to abnormal circumstances. That is what we would call expected forms of human suffering. We would be worried if they did not do that. Imagine if somebody went through all of that and just carried on as normal. That would be unhealthy. So it's important, even Jung reminds us that suffering is not an illness. Suffering is not an illness. This is what Aristotle is reminding us. We cannot understand well-being exclusively from a hedonic side. So to remind you, what I was saying is that the resilient features refer to the existing strengths, resources, positive qualities, characteristics, behaviors, functioning relationships that were retained from before exposure to adversity and survived despite their exposure to adversity. Whereas adversity-activated development, what I call adversity-activated development, is exactly that. The development that has been activated because people have been exposed to adversity, new strengths, resources, positive qualities, characteristics, behaviors, functioning that were activated and acquired from the very exposure to adversity, and they did not exist before. The pandemic is horrible, it's negative, but in my neighborhood in London that I've been living for 45 years, as a result of the pandemic, we developed a WhatsApp group and we help people, and that has been retained. That is a positive effect of a negative event. We need to have the epistemological agility to understand the complexities and not just say everything negative is everything negative. And this is really, we need to really question ourselves. Are we talking about what is mental health in these situations? What are problems? What do we mean by psychosocial difficulties? It's a nice word that tries to sort of fudge the question. There is an underlying layer of expected human suffering, and psychological symptoms can have, in addition, some psychological symptoms, and psychiatric disorders, additionally the psychiatric disorders. Does this remind you of anything? Yes, of course. The pyramid of the MHPSS reminds us of that, which is a fact. We know that in the mental health field. I'm not going to go into that. I'm sure all of you know what that is. And there it is. That's exactly where the MHPS fits into the grid. So it's essential for us to make a differentiation between distress and disorder. Distress is the expected, normal, and healthy reaction to abnormal circumstances, whereas disorder is the abnormal response to abnormal circumstances beyond the expected time, context, and impact. And yes, people they're talking about trauma. Yes, there is. It's the story of an elephant with the blind man. If you are touching this part, you say this animal is a snake, and he's right. What he doesn't have is the holistic understanding of the whole phenomenon. And I'm asking myself all the time, am I looking at the whole phenomenon or only at one part? No problem if I focus on the one part, as long as I know what the totality is. The problem is, again, what am I looking here? Am I looking at the pain, or am I looking at the resilience? Or do I have a viable framework that allows me to look at both? And that is complexity. If we do not make this differentiation, then we basically install in people the victim identity. Victims of adversity are victims of adversity. And it's the inevitable outcome of being exposed to adverse and devastating events and circumstances. If I lost my house to an earthquake, I'm a victim of the earthquake. But developing a victim identity is something that I develop I co-construct in my interactions with the people who help me and the systems who help me, which means you and me, yes, and the systems that we have. And that, as we know, can develop passivity, lack of responsibility, inappropriate dependence, entitlement, empowers people, and develops what we call in psychology learned helplessness. We teach them to become helpless. And that, I would argue, takes longer to overcome, to survive from that than the original trauma. And I would say that the secondary victimization is when we, the people who want to help them, with our language, with the structure of our services, in effect, we victimize them again. This is the adversity grid again. And therefore, the holistic approach is about this complexity, uniqueness, and totality. And I am ending, yes, I have, with this 2 slides. During the crisis, the refugee crisis, 2015-16, I was doing some work with some consultancies in Greece, and I took this photograph. Across here is Turkey, and a boat just arrived, and people were wet, and the Red Cross gave them new clothes. They got new clothes, and then they got into a bus and they left. And then I saw this, and I took a photograph of that. And that, you may know, is a makeup brush. And I like this because it tells me, idiot Renos, you have your theories. Do you understand what this is? And I don't understand that. And I love not to understand things. I want to imagine what man, woman used that, with what story. And there's a human story there. It's nothing to do with mental health or with, somebody wanted to beautify themselves or whatever. I don't know. It's nice to remember of these things. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm here to answer any questions and interact with you. And again, I'm sorry I'm not with you today.
Thank you very much, Professor Renos Papadopoulos, for this very, very inspiring talk. We can now accept questions from the audience. For those of you in person, I will kindly ask for you to come here so that Professor Papadopoulos can see you and that we can catch you on camera. But please go ahead, the floor is yours. I think everyone is very shy.
So perhaps I've succeeded in confusing all of you.
Yep, we have a question.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, I'm Brana Ertel. I'm a psychologist in a women's center here in Berlin. I wanted to ask you, when you talked about victim identity, do you think that in modern generation, especially generation Z, there is an increase in this victim identity? Could you tell us more about it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the difficulty is that I would argue that all generations are susceptible to that, but in particular modern, Z generation or whatever. You see, it's a very, very complex issue, and I really urge you to consider that and study that if you are working in this field, because there is a lot of complexity there. The moment I see myself as a victim, I want to be compensated, to be understood and helped, and that's fine. But where are the boundaries of the reasonable and the unreasonable? Because let's not forget, there are many things conspiring in this situation. The nature of our system of care, which is not wrong, but it's inevitable. We should not think of simplistic solutions. Rewards vulnerability. The more vulnerable I am, the more tragic my story, the more damage I have experienced, the more compensations and services I may receive. And that there is some logic there, but we need to be careful about the complexity. I'm not saying that there isn't any logic, but we need to be careful, because by rewarding vulnerability, not just responding positively to help, then inevitably there is the tendency that it develops the victim identity, the passivity, the entitlement. Give me because I am a victim, etc., etc. And don't lynch me, please. But perhaps this far right that is attacking all of us, maybe, I'm not justifying anything that they do, please, but they may pick up on the fact that we overdo it in overcompensating people, and some passivity is developed. So we need to be a little bit fair for ourselves and the people we want to help. How quickly do we want to bring them into functioning, as many of you have mentioned before, rather than stay in that passive role? But our services are geared to that inevitably. So there are difficult issues. There are not simple issues, and certainly we cannot solve them with slogans. Slogans do not solve things. We need to understand the complexities, the paradoxes, and the struggles and the dilemmas that we face. That's where we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah, please, go ahead.
I see very well your point. On the other hand, I think it's very difficult because refugees, they don't actually have a lot of possibilities to play an active role. Like they have no the decisions about where they are staying, if they have to leave a country, they're not taken by themselves, and they have no control, and they don't understand how these decisions are taken. They're often not allowed to work. It's not them who decides where they live, but it's the country's administration. So in a lot of, nearly all parts of their lives, they cannot decide if their family comes or not, if they can see them or not, if they can travel or not. So I think they're very, very passive, and I'm asking myself, so how can we avoid that they feel like victims and that they develop a victim identity? Because it's not always in our hands.
I am not saying they are not victims. They are victims of circumstances. Can we help them not to develop a victim identity? Can we differentiate with complexity to respond to the way that the adversities victimize them without developing their victim identity? In other words, when we see them, I'll go back to that photograph that I showed you. What do we see there? Do we see only their victim parts, or do we see some of their strengths? Part of the work that I always do, try to sort of see what things I cannot change, and we'll fight with our lawyers, etc., to give them rights and all of that and all. But as it is, what strengths do they already have? Are they aware of those? Am I aware of those? Are we using those? In other words, he's a poet. He doesn't need papers from the ministry to act his poetry and go to a school and read his poetry. It depends on you and me seeing that, valuing that, and creating an opportunity for that person to do that, for that person to feel more human being, knowing that, yes, I was victimized by the regime in my country and by the legislation in Europe, etc., but I'm also a human being, that I have some value and some strength. So this is what I'm talking about. Do we see only the negative, or do we see in every person everything? And they're not going to tell us the positive things. It's up to us to, in our interaction with them, to see the positive. Because if we talk to them only about their pain, their trauma, their losses, they will be talking about that all the time. And then they see themselves as incarnations of only that. That's my point. And my argument and my challenge is, think about that and see the person that you're going to work tomorrow, what strengths do they have that perhaps we haven't noticed yesterday? And then which ones can we use? I'm not naive. Please, I've been working in this field, for 50 years, long before it was fashionable and all of that, and under very difficult conditions. So it's possible. It's possible. What is it possible that you and I can do without moaning about the governments and the system? We should do that also. So it's not either or. So I'm talking about other dimensions and complexities. And that's a very good example. Yes, they have been victimized by the circumstances in their countries and the legislation in Europe. But what strengths and positive things do you and I see in them? And that we can remind them, we can notice them, we can value them, and we can bring them into the play, into our package of interacting with them. If we do that, you will be surprised by how many things you can still see. But if we look at only what you said, which is absolutely right, and I'm going back to the elephant, what you say is correct. If you're touching that tail, is real. But what else is there? What else is there? And that is the epistemological agility I'm talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions, either here or online? No? Yes, I'm hoping to be able to assist with what Professor Papadopoulos was saying. I came to his work through the world of narrative therapy, and essentially the idea is looking at people through a multi-dimensional lens, being able to see them not through a single-sided story, not through a single part of their identity, but being able to see the complexity of what they are, seeing them essentially as human beings, as this lady over there told us earlier. I do have a question which Professor Papadopoulos, it has to do with your work at the MA and PhD programs in refugee care at the University of Essex. We know that you facilitated dialogue among practitioners from diverse cultural and professional backgrounds. In your experience, what kinds of shifts in understandings and in attitudes of the staff have you noticed throughout this time? How has this framework, the framework that you're talking to us about today, has changed the ways they engage therapeutically with people who have fled their home countries?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Yes, it's not easy. It's not easy because my first response is that we're not talking about something that we do and then that's it. I keep repeating to you that I am talking about this today. I've been writing for ages and all of that. Tomorrow, when I'm going to be working in the field, and I'm working in the Middle East right now, I will need to remind myself that I am likely, not unlikely, I will be, the margin of error. You do not wish it away and you cannot get rid of it. It's always going to be there. And you are a better scientist if you know in what way it is there so that you can calculate it. So I've seen a lot of changes in staff, and a lot of the organizations that I've been collaborating, of course, over the years have been adopting the adversity grid and all of that. But all of us are struggling with that. I mean, for example, when we're hearing the usual stories that we talk about refugees, I don't know, left Afghanistan, went through the mountains, and then was smuggled into Turkey, and then he crossed the Aegean, etc., etc., and all of these ordeals and unbelievable suffering and attacks and all sorts of things. We're thinking trauma. But exactly the same narrative, we can see, wow, how many people would have the strength to have survived all of that? Exactly the same story. You may see it as an indication of trauma, or you can see it as a unique indication of a unique strength and of resilience of a human being. The same story, the same person, and both are right, both are true. But usually, in order to write reports and get funding and this and that, we just go only for the one and we neglect the other. And please, I'm not saying think of strengths and silver lining. I'm not sort of adolescent optimistic idealist. I'm talking about the realities that in addition to all the suffering, we start with the suffering, with the losses. We take that very seriously. We connect with them through that, but also do not stop there, and we do not get paralyzed by that, but also try to see what that human being in front of us, what else is there? And this is what I've seen. And it's been very encouraging that all the organizations that I've been working with have been able to embark on this, which is difficult. It's not easy because we need to keep on working in both worlds, the positive and the negative, seeing both and working with both.
Thank you very much. We wish we had more time with you, Professor Papadopoulos, but we have to wrap up. So thank you again for honoring us with your presence today. That was very, very fruitful, and it's a nice bridge, actually, to the next part of today's event.